The Lighthouse and the Last Tide, Part 1, The Unseen Shore, Chapter 1, The Tide's Promise. Dr. Maris Thorne stepped from her battered rental car, the salt-laced wind of Port Blossom immediately asserting its dominance. It whipped her auburn hair across her face and carried the scent of brine and damp earth, a stark contrast to the sterile air of her university lab. Her purpose, however, was as clear and sharp as the coastal light, the critically endangered Pacific green sea turtle. Her laptop, cradled carefully in a waterproof bag, held years of data, migratory patterns, and a dwindling set of theoretical nesting sites. All signs pointed here, to Port Blossom, and specifically to the treacherous waters surrounding the old, weathered lighthouse that stood sentinel on its own rocky islet offshore. Port Blossom was a town etched by time and tide, its clapboard houses painted in muted blues and greens, clinging to a hillside that sloped gently towards a harbor dotted with fishing boats. People moved at a different pace here, their faces weathered by the sun and sea, their eyes holding a deep, quiet knowledge. Maris, with her urban speed and scientific urgency, felt like an anomaly. She wasn't here for quaintness, though. She was here for a species teetering on the brink. Her first stop was the harbor master, a burly man named Gus with a walrus mustache and an unlit pipe perpetually clamped between his teeth. He eyed her sleek, expensive research equipment with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. "Going out to the light, are you, Doc?" he rumbled, thumbing through a logbook. "Silas ain't much for company." Maris nodded, her jaw set. "I'm not looking for company, Mr. Peterson. I'm looking for turtles. My research indicates a high probability of finding nesting grounds near the lighthouse's waters." Gus chuckled, a dry sound like stones rattling. "Silas Blackwood knows the sea better than any chart. If there's turtles, he'd know. But getting him to say anything, that's another matter. Ain't left that rock in years." The legend of Silas Blackwood preceded him like the fog that often rolled in from the Pacific. A phantom of local lore, a man whose self-imposed exile had become the stuff of whispered tales. Maris, a woman of facts and verifiable data, dismissed such romanticism. She needed information, not folklore. She needed access. Securing a small, sturdy dinghy, one that Gus reluctantly agreed was seaworthy enough for someone foolhardy enough to try, Maris packed on gear, sonar, underwater cameras, GPS, and a good supply of protein bars. The waves, even in the relatively calm harbor, bucked and swayed, a restless energy hinting at the ocean's true power. She knew this wouldn't be easy. Nothing truly vital ever was. As she cast off, the lighthouse, a stoic pillar of stone, seemed to loom larger, its dark windows like unblinking eyes watching her approach. Chapter 2, The Silent Keeper. The journey to the islet was a test of both skill and patience. The dinghy, a resolute little vessel, grappled with the increasingly agitated swells that rose and fell like a giant's breath. Maris, a seasoned sailor from her field expeditions, navigated the currents with practiced ease, her gaze fixed on the lighthouse. It was a beautiful, melancholic monument, its granite base scarred by centuries of ocean fury, its glass lantern room gleaming like a crown. Reaching the small, rocky landing was a precarious affair. She timing her approach between larger waves, scrambling ashore and securing the dinghy to a barnacle-encrusted ring bolted into the rock. The air here was raw, untamed, smelling powerfully of salt, seaweed, and the deep, cold ocean. She climbed the winding, moss-slicked path to the lighthouse door, a heavy, iron-bound slab of oak that looked as old as the rock itself. She knocked, a firm, scientific rap that echoed eerily in the solitude. Silence, She knocked again, louder, identifying herself, explaining her purpose, a marine biologist, here for the turtles. The only response was the cry of gulls circling overhead and the ceaseless roar of the waves against the islet's base. Frustration, hot and unwelcome, began to prick at her. This wasn't how science worked. Data needed to be collected, observations made, hypotheses tested, and for that, she needed to know where to look. Undeterred by Silas's stony silence, Maris began her own meticulous observations. She spent the next few days circling the islet in her dinghy, braving the increasingly unpredictable currents, deploying her hydrophones to listen for the subtle clicks and calls of marine life. She charted ocean temperatures, salinity, and potential feeding grounds. She spotted the occasional Pacific green sea turtle, their ancient, dappled shells breaking the surface for a breath before diving back into the turquoise depths. They were magnificent, graceful creatures, their movements a testament to ancient survival. But the vital piece of the puzzle, the nesting sites, remained elusive. Her charts showed the probable areas, but the specific, sheltered coves, the sandy expanses preferred by the females for laying their precious eggs, were hidden. Each day she'd return to the landing, hoping for a sign, a flicker of movement from the lighthouse, any indication that Silas Blackwood had heard her, acknowledged her. But the lighthouse door remained resolutely shut, a symbol of his impenetrable solitude. It felt like she was knocking on the door of the ocean itself. Chapter 3. Jenkins's Riddles. Back in Port Blossom, Maris sought out the town's quiet sources of information. Her quest led her to Old Man Jenkins, a wizened, bent figure who presided over a cluttered antique shop filled with the ghosts of forgotten maritime lives. Books stacked precariously, faded maps curled on shelves, and the aroma of old paper and dust filled the air. Jenkins, with eyes that twinkled with an ancient wisdom, was Port Blossom's unofficial historian, a living archive of local legends and half-forgotten truths. Maris explained her mission, her scientific jargon met with a patient, knowing smile. Jenkins listened, occasionally wheezing, his frail hands stroking the spines of leather-bound tomes. "Turtles, you say?" he murmured, his voice raspy like dry leaves. "Aye, they've always been here, long before any charts or scientific names." "My research indicates these waters are crucial," Maris pressed, her frustration building. "But I need to find the specific nesting areas. Silas Blackwood, the lighthouse keeper, he must know. Locals say he hasn't left the islet in years. He's been guarding something, hasn't he?" Jenkins's eyes narrowed, a glint of something unreadable in their depths. "Silas has a deep connection to the sea, Dr. Thorne, deeper than most. He guards what he holds dear with a ferocity few understand." He paused, a long, contemplative silence stretching between them. "Some things," he finally wheezed, his gaze drifting to a faded photograph of a clipper ship battling a storm, "are best kept by the sea itself and those who guard her secrets." Maris shifted impatiently. "But lives are at stake, Mr. Jenkins. A species is dying out. This isn't about secrets. It's about survival." Jenkins merely offered another cryptic smile. "Survival, young woman, often depends on understanding the tide, not just charting its currents. Silas, he understands the tide, and he lost much to its fury." He never elaborated, never revealed specifics, simply offered these veiled pronouncements that grated on Maris's scientific sensibilities. She wanted data, not parables. That evening, as Maris returned to her small, rented cottage overlooking the harbor, the sky in the west was a bruised purple, and the wind had taken on an insistent, keening note. The waves, which had been agitated for days, now crashed against the shore with a new, raw power. Local fishermen were pulling their boats further up the docks, securing them with extra ropes. Gus Peterson, the harbor master, had called out a warning. "Big one's coming, Dr. Thorne. Stay ashore." But Maris, driven by the dwindling window of opportunity for turtle nesting, felt an inexplicable pull towards the lighthouse. She had one more hypothesis to test, one more area to survey before the weather turned truly foul. The thought of those ancient creatures, vulnerable and unseen, gnawed at her. She ignored the warnings, the rising howl of the wind, and the ominous darkening of the horizon. Logic dictated she wait, but her scientific imperative, a fierce, almost primal instinct, urged her onward. She climbed into her dinghy, the sturdy little boat now looking perilously small against the darkening, churning expanse of the Pacific. Part 2. The Crucible, Chapter 4. The Fury Descends. The storm hit with a ferocity that dwarfed anything Maris had anticipated. It didn't just arrive, it descended, a monstrous, churning vortex of wind and water that swallowed the horizon whole. The ocean, which only hours before had been merely agitated, now rose in towering emerald walls, crashing against the islet with the force of a battering ram. Maris, caught halfway through her final survey, found herself fighting a battle for survival. Her dinghy, usually so reliable, was tossed like a toy, visibility dropping to near zero as rain lashed down in blinding sheets. She fought the tiller, her muscles screaming, the roar of the wind deafening. The lighthouse, her only beacon, was periodically swallowed by the spray and rain, then re-emerged, a stoic silhouette against the apocalyptic sky. She knew, with chilling certainty, that trying to return to Port Blossom was suicide. Her only option was the islet, the grim sanctuary of the lighthouse. It was a miracle she made it to the landing. The waves threatened to tear her boat apart, but a sheer force of will and years of experience guided her to the small, relatively sheltered cove. Scrambling ashore, soaked to the bone and shaking with adrenaline, she dragged the dinghy higher onto the rocks, praying it wouldn't be claimed by the raging tide. She fought her way up the winding path to the lighthouse door, now battered by the wind, splinters flying from the old wood. This time, as she hammered on the heavy oak, spurred by sheer desperation, she heard it, a creak, a groan, and then the grudging withdrawal of bolts. Silas Blackwood stood there, a towering figure framed by the dim light of the interior, his face a road map of weathered lines, his eyes dark and shadowed. He didn't speak, didn't offer a welcoming gesture, simply stepped aside, allowing the storm to fling Maris into the cramped, salt-scented interior before he slammed the heavy door shut, sealing them inside. The wind howled like a banshee, rattling the very foundations of the lighthouse, battering the thick glass panes of the lantern room high above. The sea crashed against the islet, isolating them completely. 3 agonizing days stretched before them. Chapter 5. Walls Within Walls. The lighthouse was a world unto itself, a cylindrical fortress against the chaos outside. The air was thick with the scent of salt, old oil, and something indefinably ancient. Spiral stairs wound upwards, revealing glimpses of the keeper's sparse living quarters. A small kitchen with a wood-burning stove, a cot against the wall, shelves crammed with books and charts, their edges curled with damp. Initial tension was a palpable third presence in the small space. Maris, shivering and exhausted, peeled off her drenched gear, acutely aware of Silas's silent scrutiny. He moved with an economical grace, a man utterly at home in his solitary domain. He offered her a mug of lukewarm coffee, thick, black, and surprisingly comforting, and a plate of stale biscuits. There was no conversation, no polite inquiries, just the constant, furious roar of the storm, a white noise that amplified the awkward silence between them. Maris, driven by her scientific imperative, found it impossible to completely abandon her professional persona. "The turtles," she began, the words feeling insignificant against the storm's fury. "I was out tracking." Silas merely grunted, his gaze fixed on the churning gray outside the narrow window. "Foolish," he muttered, the first word he'd spoken to her, his voice a low gravel. "The sea has its own schedule, doesn't care for yours." His bluntness stung. Maris felt her own defensiveness rise. "I'm trying to save a species, Mr. Blackwood, something you seem content to let vanish if it means not disturbing your solitude." He turned then, his dark eyes meeting hers, and for the first time Maris saw not just a recluse, but a flicker of a deeper, more profound pain. "Solitude," he echoed, "is sometimes a different kind of protection." He said no more, retreating to the lantern room, leaving Maris alone with the wind and the unsettling weight of his words. Their shared world, for now, was a cramped, claustrophobic sphere of unspoken conflict, Maris's scientific urgency clashing with Silas's entrenched secrecy, two stubborn wills trapped by an indifferent, raging ocean. Chapter 6. Echoes in the Gale. The storm raged through the first day and into the second, its intensity unwavering. The routine they fell into was born of necessity. Silas maintaining the lamp, checking the lighthouse's integrity. Maris trying to warm herself by the stove, reviewing her soaked notes, her mind restless. The cramped quarters forced them into proximity, and gradually, slowly, the initial tension began to thaw, replaced by a grudging respect born of shared endurance. During the long, storm-swept nights, fueled by the lukewarm coffee and stale biscuits, Silas's defenses began to crumble. The constant shrieking of the wind, the endless crash of waves, seemed to wear away at his silence. He began to speak of the sea, not as a subject of study, but as a living entity he understood on a primal level. He spoke of its moods, its deceptive calm, its sudden, brutal rages. He recounted tales of ships lost, of fishermen swallowed whole, of the raw, untamed power that sculpted the coast. Then, one evening, as the lighthouse lantern swept its beam through the rain-streaked darkness, illuminating the swirling chaos outside, he spoke of his wife and young daughter. His voice, usually gruff, softened with a pain so palpable it seemed to fill the small space. He described them vividly, his wife's laughter, his daughter's bright, curious eyes. He told Maris how, years ago, during a storm of similar ferocity, they had attempted to reach the mainland for urgent medical help for their ailing daughter. The desperate journey, the unforgiving ocean, the small boat overwhelmed. He had watched from the lighthouse, helpless. The tragedy was etched into his every word, his every silent gesture. The lighthouse, once a beacon of safety, had become a symbol of his grief. His self-imposed exile a penance, a way to stay close to the vast, indifferent force that had taken them. And the turtles, he explained, with their ancient, vulnerable journey to shore, were a part of that wild, untamed beauty he felt compelled to protect from human interference, a vulnerability he himself had been unable to shield his family from. "The sea takes," he said, his voice raspy with emotion, "but it also gives, and those who respect her understand that balance. They learn to protect what she nurtures." Chapter 7. Shared Solitude. Maris listened, mesmerized, the scientific detachment she usually cultivated dissolving in the face of such raw, enduring grief. She saw in Silas not a stubborn recluse, but a man deeply scarred, his solitude a monument to his loss. The storm outside, raging with undiminished fury, seemed to mirror the tempest within him. In turn, Maris found herself sharing her own vulnerabilities. She spoke of the immense pressure of her research, funded by grants, driven by the ticking clock of extinction. The fear of failure, not just for her career, but for the species she devoted her life to. She spoke of the profound loneliness that often accompanied her unyielding dedication, the sacrifices she'd made in personal relationships for the sake of her work. She confessed to the exhausting weight of being a hopeful voice in a world increasingly indifferent to its disappearing wonders. They were two souls, isolated in their own ways, now bound together by the storm's brutal embrace. Her scientific methodology, his primal guardianship, both stemmed from a fierce, undeniable love for the natural world, particularly the ocean. They approached it from different angles, but their core passion was the same. He saw her dedication not as an intrusion, but as a mirrored commitment. She saw his pain not as stubbornness, but as profound wisdom forged in suffering. The air in the lighthouse, once heavy with unspoken conflict, now held a fragile understanding. They talked late into the nights, the rhythm of the storm a constant backdrop. Silas recounted more tales of the sea, of the changing currents, of ancient fishermen's wisdom, knowledge passed down through generations. Maris spoke of DNA sequencing, migratory tags, and the global fragility of marine ecosystems. They were two different languages, slowly beginning to find common ground, translating the reverence they both held for the ocean into a new, shared dialogue. The walls around them, though still battered by the storm, felt less like a prison and more like a shared, unexpected refuge. Part 3. The Unspoken Vow. Chapter 8. Dawn's Gentle Hand. On the third day, the howl of the wind began to recede, a gradual tapering from a banshee's shriek to a mournful sigh. The crashing waves softened their assault, though the sea remained bruised and restless, still churning with residual power. A shift, a new, fragile quiet settled over the lighthouse, heavy with the aftermath of the storm, but also with the quiet hum of two souls forever altered by their forced proximity. Through the high windows of the lantern room, streaks of pale light began to pierce the gray, revealing a horizon slowly emerging from the tempest. The air felt cleaner, sharper, washed anew. Maris and Silas stood on the small balcony, the wind still biting but no longer violent, watching the first hesitant rays of dawn paint the eastern sky in hues of bruised violet and faint rose. The sea stretched before them, a vast expanse of shifting greens and blues, still scarred by the storm, but moving with a calmer, more predictable rhythm. The silence between them was different now, no longer fraught with tension. It was a comfortable, knowing quiet, filled with the echoes of shared stories and vulnerabilities. Maris felt a profound shift within herself. Her obsession with data had given way to a deeper understanding, a recognition that true knowledge wasn't just collected, but felt, inherited, lived. Silas, too, seemed transformed. The hard lines around his eyes were softer. His shoulders, usually hunched in self-protection, seemed less burdened. He watched the returning light intently, his gaze sweeping the distant, jagged coastline that made up the wilder, less accessible parts of Port Blossom's territory. It was as if the storm had scoured away not just the external chaos, but also the internal barriers he had meticulously built around himself for years. Chapter 9. The Guardian's Secret. He turned from the railing then, his dark eyes finally meeting Maris's. There was no more guardedness in them, only a quiet, resolute purpose. "There's a cove," he began, his voice low, almost a whisper against the whispers of the dying wind. "Hidden, accessible only at the lowest tide on certain moon cycles. I've known its rhythm since I was a boy." Maris held her breath, every scientific instinct flaring to life, but tempered now by a profound empathy. "They nest there," Silas continued, his gaze drifting back to the distant coastline, a faint, almost imperceptible curve against the brightening sky. The turtles, they've come there for generations, undisturbed. I've watched them, guarded them. He revealed that he had witnessed his wife's final desperate attempt to reach the mainland during that fateful storm, her small boat battling the same treacherous waves that now crashed, albeit more gently, against their islet. He had seen the precise moment the sea had swallowed her and their child. In his raw grief, he had made a silent, unspoken vow. He would protect this fragile life, this ancient ritual of the turtles, because he had been unable to protect his own. It was his penance, his solace, his fierce act of defiance against the very ocean that had taken so much from him. He had guarded the cove, not just from human interference that might threaten the turtles, but also, in a way, from the sea itself, by ensuring their vulnerability was respected, their sanctity preserved. Maris understood. Her scientific mission, which had once felt like a quest for data, a solitary pursuit of facts, now felt like an opportunity to honor Silas's unspoken vow. The statistics, the ecological imperative, they were still vital, but now they were imbued with a human story, a profound personal commitment to protection born of immense loss. She realized that true preservation wasn't just about scientific documentation or sterile data points. It was also about respecting the delicate balance of nature, yes, but also the profound, often painful, wisdom of those who lived alongside it, whose lives were inextricably entwined with its rhythms and its secrets. It was about connection, not just collection. Chapter 10. A Shared Horizon. As the first true rays of dawn painted the horizon in brilliant oranges and golds, turning the bruised sea into a shimmering canvas, Silas pointed. His finger, though gnarled and weathered, was steady. "They nest there," he said again, his voice no longer guarded, but filled with a quiet hope, a nascent trust Maris felt deep in her core. "You'll need the charts I have, and to know the tides, my tides, not just the almanacs." Maris knew that in the storm's crucible, she had found not only the key to saving a species, but also a profound connection, a healing balm for two souls adrift in their own isolation. The lighthouse, once a lonely sentinel, felt like a bridge. She watched the sea, no longer just a subject of study, but a powerful, living entity, capable of both destruction and profound acts of creation. Their purpose, once disparate, had merged into a shared horizon. Maris, with her scientific prowess, and Silas, with his ancient, visceral understanding, now stood on the precipice of a new kind of preservation. It was a path that honored both mind and heart, data and spirit. The storm had broken down the walls between them, revealing that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in unwavering solitude, but in the courage to break down your own walls for the sake of a shared vital purpose, for the silent, majestic creatures that navigated the depths, and for the hope of a future where wisdom, both scientific and ancient, could guide them safely home. The journey to the hidden cove would be challenging, but Maris no longer felt alone. The lighthouse, brilliant in the rising sun, no longer just a landmark, but a symbol of enduring hope, watching over a newly forged alliance against the vast indifference of the world.